Because of the video showing Russians entering Pokrovsk, there was an uproar in the Z channels. Some Russian bloggers are saying that because these videos were published, the attempt was thwarted and the column was destroyed.
Now to the point. Because of some idiot who filmed this and leaked it online, today there are piles of dead and burned out equipment there.
At the same time, Putin's soldiers are fleeing the front more and more often. This was reported by a captain of the Russian army who deserted from the so-called special military operation to journalists from the Khodorkovsky Live project. He also spoke about resettings, extortion, alcoholism, and drug addiction among Putin's troops, as well as other horrors in the army.
Several people from our unit died during training. The nurses walk around. In the evening, some of them turn into geishas. Our officers would just shoot. If someone didn't give the pin code, he would shoot him.
According to him, only riffraff are fighting in Ukraine, criminals and people with addictions.
It's already clear that people are simply being sent into a meat grinder.
Putin continues to throw people into the furnace of war. In grueling battles, Russian forces are trying to isolate and encircle Hulyapol in the Zaporizhzhia region. They are using infiltration tactics and striking supply routes, according to the Institute for the Study of War. At the same time, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived at the front in the Zaporizhzhia region, in the Orikhiv direction, in great detail.
We discussed today with the commanders what is needed to strengthen our positions and how to provide more forces in this direction. It's an important direction. I am grateful for the complete information about the specific difficulties here in the Zaporizhzhia region.
He visited the command post of the 65th Separate Mechanized Brigade Veliki Lu, which, as part of the 17th Corps, is holding the defense in this direction, as well as the soldiers of the 128th Separate Mountain Assault Brigade who are defending Stepnohirsk.
Oleksandr Musiienko, serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, head of the Center for Military Legal Studies. He is with us in the studio today. Mr. Oleksandr, welcome.
Thank you.
And that says it all.
So more than 300 Russians are currently in Pokrovsk. This was reported by the 7th Corps of the Air Assault Forces. According to the military, the occupiers have intensified their efforts to infiltrate the city, and their goal remains unchanged, to reach the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk and then attempt to encircle entire agglomerations. In turn, Ukrainian defenders continue to detect and destroy enemy groups in urban areas, even under conditions of low visibility.
Friends, and we have a few more important points to add. In particular, President Volodymyr Zelensky literally held a meeting with Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky this evening. And as noted in the post by the head of the Ukrainian state, the greatest attention is currently being paid to the Pokrovsk direction and Zaporizhzhia region, where the Russians are increasing the number and scale of their assaults. And another very important and interesting point they discussed with the Commander-in-Chief, the preparation of our deep strikes, specific directions and expected results. Ukrainian long-range sanctions must be in effect every day, and this is being achieved. We will talk about this as well. Mr. Oleksandr, for now I suggest we focus on what is happening on the line of contact. In particular, this video, which is still being discussed there. But the story already has a continuation. I mean, this particular kind of Russian advance taking place under the fog in the area of Pokrovsk really stands out.
Under the fog, that's absolutely right. They are trying to take advantage of the weather conditions because, as you understand, there are technical difficulties for drone operations. Precisely at the moment when these weather conditions worsen. This applies to our drones as well as to the enemy's drones. In the same way, they also somewhat reduce their activity. Because right now, if we take Pokrovsk in that direction, it is characterized by the fact that enemy infantry groups are operating there, but also a significant number of drones are concentrated on our side, which are destroying the enemy as well as on the enemy's side. As for that column, I assume that many of them did not live to see the moment to re-watch this video, and
the videos that come in by the evening already testify to this.
And maybe there, in some historical newsreels. All of it looked, quite, well, let me put it this way, not to underestimate the enemy's capabilities, but it all looked rather, like in World War II, when the Nazis would come in on motorcycles and so on. Those were the kinds of impressions I got. That's why these infantry groups are being destroyed. Obviously, the enemy is using and employing various means, motorcycles among them. Unfortunately, in some cases, they do demonstrate their effectiveness in terms of mobility because they allow the enemy to carry out certain maneuvers. But these groups are detected and destroyed. Because if everything were going as well as the enemy wants to present it, especially by showing certain videos and shaping narratives, then what Putin announced 2 weeks ago should have already been accomplished. Pokrovsk should already be encircled, and journalists should have come to film it. But somehow there are no representatives of Western media to be seen, nor is there any sign of Pokrovsk being encircled. And what does that mean? Broadly speaking, it's important to explain here what actually started at the end of October, when the enemy concentrated its forces and advanced, began entering Pokrovsk in groups more actively, attacking Mirnohrad, trying to cut off the flanks and disrupt logistics. We managed to withstand the first round of this battle. Yes, with certain losses, given that the enemy entered and is now directly present there, in Pokrovsk trying to take action. But we managed to repel this first wave. However, it's clear that the enemy is not giving up on its intentions. They will continue to carry out offensive actions. While this first wave and the enemy onslaught were underway, Ukraine's defense forces managed to deploy reinforcements, essentially to be able to operate, including under the difficult conditions in Pokrovsk. There, Special Operations Forces and special units of the main intelligence directorate are operating, as well as assault regiments of the armed forces of Ukraine and the brigades of the armed forces that are stationed in this direction, among others. In addition, certain rotation measures were successfully carried out. This is also very important, and logistics have been restored with certain specifics and nuances, but it is happening. None of what the enemy claimed has actually happened. However, the situation is further complicated by the following. It is clear that now the enemy will essentially launch another wave towards Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. There is an understanding of this, and our units are countering as best they can. In addition, the Russian forces have basically decided, somewhat predictably, according to their old approach, their doctrine and tactics are not that complicated. Wherever they had success, that's where they try to build on it. And in fact, what they are doing in the Pokrovsk direction is a consequence of their actions earlier in Avdiivka. And so, as they thought back then, we broke through, and in about a year and a half, they advanced up to 40 kilometers. This is the movement of Russian troops. And this year, by the way, the enemy actually had perhaps their greatest successes not in the Pokrovsk direction. It was in the Novopavlivka direction, where unfortunately the enemy managed to advance. This is exactly at the junction of three regions, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Dnipropetrovsk. We are now seeing a situation where the enemy has advanced and achieved certain tactical successes, taking advantage of the fact that they are using the cover of weather conditions, and drones are not always able to detect and destroy them in time. But the weather will also change, and accordingly, the actions of our units will change as well in order to slow down this advance. And the enemy is trying to stretch the front line somewhat for us, so that we have to extend our defense. We understand that. That is, certain units that were operating, including in the Novopavlivka direction, were redeployed, some of them to the Pokrovsk area, specifically to hold back the enemy, and they managed to do so there. The enemy is trying to advance here, and we are maneuvering. That is why, for us, the concept of these assault troops as such is very important. It's not just about assaults, it's about an operational reserve that shouldn't be committed to battle within specific time frames, but rather kept in the rear, waiting and preparing to be rapidly deployed to certain locations as needed, like now, when we need them in Zaporizhzhia because of the situation there.
Today, our defense forces are also taking other factors into account. In particular, increasing the number of unmanned systems units is our priority. This was emphasized by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Oleksandr Musiienko. According to him, the unmanned systems forces are delivering concrete results in destroying the enemy, and this number is only increasing. FPV drones and heavy bombers have proven to be the most effective in operation. Let's listen.
The occupiers are adopting our experience, particularly in creating regiments of unmanned systems and interceptor drones, and are allocating significant resources to these. We must constantly improve in order to maintain our technological advantage. Special attention is being paid to scaling up unmanned systems units, increasing the number of trained crews, recruiting personnel, and creating the infrastructure necessary for their effective operation. Oleksandr Musiienko, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Mr. Oleksandr, considering the statistics we've heard from the 7th Air Assault Corps about over 300 servicemen, and what we're now hearing from Mr. Musiienko about the need to increase the number and capabilities of drone strikes, are these things connected? Or how will a greater number of drones help us reduce the number of occupiers in this direction?
I'll explain it very simply. The thing is, as of today, the main objective set by the command, and this is what the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi, talks about, is that in order to preserve lives, it is necessary to avoid, as much as possible, contact battles, meaning close-range firefights with small arms. If we are constantly engaged in close-range firefights with small arms, it's very difficult, because the enemy has the advantage, and therefore we need to destroy the enemy as they approach. Right now, many battalion, brigade, and even company commanders are actually following this practice. Why? Because, in fact, on certain sections of the front, we have an advantage over the enemy in reconnaissance capabilities thanks to UAVs. Unfortunately, we don't have an advantage everywhere when it comes to fiber optic and FPV drones, because the enemy is also active, and they are trying to improve and scale up their production. But definitely, wherever we have an advantage in reconnaissance, it is used as effectively as possible, because as soon as a group of infantry is detected in certain areas, the appropriate commands are given immediately, strikes are adjusted right away, and the drones start to operate. Wherever artillery can reach, it is used. Where it can't, drones are used to the fullest extent possible. This is how the enemy is destroyed. Well, we understand perfectly well that a lot of drones are needed, because when a group of infantry advances, it needs to be eliminated. Accordingly, there is a real need, but this truly saves lives. In other words, this helps the infantryman in today's battle, just as the development of robotic systems does, by the way. In fact, following the results of this meeting, the progress in developing robotic systems for various tasks, including logistics, was also highly praised. Recently, as you know, the President of Ukraine honored the units that evacuated a wounded soldier for the 7th time, who had spent 33 days at the positions. And thanks to the fact that he had a very good comrade who followed the instructions given by the medics, and thanks to the ability to maintain logistics, particularly with the help of drones that delivered medicines and everything necessary to the positions, on the 7th attempt after 6 unsuccessful ones, a robot evacuated the wounded soldier. And he was delivered to the stabilization point. So there are things like this. Now imagine carrying out an evacuation using a car or armored vehicle. How risky that is, how many people it requires, and what risks it poses. So this whole component, it helps, it really does save lives in some cases, and it is extremely necessary. But we need to scale up. So despite everything, even though we are growing more, every month, if we look at the statistics, the number of enemy targets destroyed as a result of drone strikes, which, by the way, are always video confirmed because that's mandatory, keeps increasing. And it's scaling up. But still, we need even more. We still need more. That's why ramping up and increasing production is very important for us.
Mr. Oleksandr, a quick clarification. Usually when we talk about the use of unmanned systems, it's about defensive operations. Well, in particular, obviously, on our side. In your opinion, and I'll ask you again to please be as concise as possible, are unmanned systems a universal tool, or are they primarily for defensive purposes and not really for offensive operations?
Well,
counteroffensive.
They are definitely universal. Deep strikes demonstrate this as well. These are elements of active defense, I would say. That is, by bringing the war onto Russian territory, we are actively defending ourselves by inflicting destruction and losses on the enemy on their own soil, weakening their military and economic potential.
Drone attacks on Russia are ongoing. Today, unmanned systems struck the Saratov oil refinery. A series of explosions occurred there, followed by a large-scale fire. According to the General Staff, the results of the strikes are currently being clarified.
In addition, the General Staff confirmed a strike on the oil refinery in Orsk-Orenburg region. According to sources from We Are Ukraine, the Russian oil refinery was attacked by SBU drones. After the strike, the primary oil processing unit caught fire there. The Orsk oil refinery is one of the largest in the region and is located almost 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Well, Mr. Oleksandr, since we've already started talking about deep strikes, let's continue with deep strikes then.
Let's continue.
Especially since the president voiced this idea. Strike Russia every day. To what extent do we have such capabilities, and maybe even every day and several times a day?
Well, in fact, strikes are being carried out almost every day, and they will continue to be carried out. The question is about scaling up, developing our capabilities and capacities, and they are also evolving. I can say that the components of the defense and security forces involved are constantly improving their tactics and their work. The goal that is set The goal is the effectiveness of strikes and hits, bypassing the enemy's air defense systems, exhausting them, and in some cases, destroying those systems. I can say that, for example, the serious work being done by the drone forces and their constant improvement are facts and have produced very powerful results. I can also tell you that the Special Operations Forces have made quite significant progress as well in the armed forces in order to make their attacks more. So now it has come to the point where more is needed and it needs to be more effective. But of course, production is also needed to constantly support these capabilities. But yes, I think that all the real tools needed to carry out these attacks are already being used in practice. It's just that, unfortunately, not everything always goes successfully. Not everything always reaches its target as we would like. But I would also like to draw attention to another very important trend. What we are seeing, including, for example, in Moscow, the fact that covert plans are being activated there and so on, airfields are being closed, and so forth. Just a few months ago, I want to remind you, it was very difficult to get through the air defense around Moscow. There is a layered system there. There were significant difficulties with this. Now we see that the Moscow region is gradually, and even Moscow itself, what does this mean? This demonstrates our effectiveness, the growth of our capabilities.
And the fact that they are also without power has already been confirmed by Russian media. Meanwhile, Russia is testing Europe's resilience. That is why it is using its drones. This is the opinion of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. According to him, the occupiers deliberately violated the airspace of European countries as they wanted to test their readiness to respond to threats.
Europe is afraid of the word escalation, and Europeans always think that any response on their part is an escalation. But I believe, on the contrary, that Russia does not respect weakness. Any intellectual responses, and those are exactly the kinds of responses Europe gives, are seen as weakness by Russia. Violations of European airspace in various countries by drones, all of these are tests. All these drone attacks by Putin are tests to see what they are capable of. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine.
On the one hand, it's about testing the readiness of European countries, but on the other, it's about not being afraid to offer some resistance. So what exactly is Putin testing here? What does he want to feel out?
Well, among other things, as the President of Ukraine points out, Russia really is testing readiness. Russia is testing... There is a whole range of reasons here. Because on the one hand, strategically, Russia is destabilizing the security system in Europe. They are testing how prepared European countries are for this type of threat, like drones, how well their doctrines and military strategies are adapted to countering unmanned aerial vehicles and modern warfare. This is exactly what we are seeing now in the example of Russian aggression against Ukraine. In addition, Russia always tries to undermine the unity of Europeans and the unity of NATO in this way. They are not succeeding in this because, as you can see, Britain still responded to Belgium's call to share its experience and even provide military units that will help protect the airspace over Belgian territory. There are countries that still say that the drones are probably Russian. They don't state this 100%, they don't claim it for certain. There are those who see everything as it really is. But I'll tell you, pay attention to the situation that happened there. There was a kind of lull when United States reconnaissance planes were flying over the Baltic Sea. And what kind of coincidence is that? The US sends up aircraft, they're flying, and at that moment nothing happens. No cables are damaged, no drones take off, and that's because Russian drones are launched from ships. That's the first point. And the second is about the Baltic Sea. You have to understand that these are major threats to Europe from within, because a significant number of these drones are likely being launched from the territory of European Union countries. And what does that mean? It means that somewhere there is a certain agent network, which either for Russian money or for other reasons, is trying to actually expand these networks. And well, listen, if we're talking about an air base where US nuclear weapons and aircraft might be stored, and drones can fly over it twice a week, that's a serious warning sign. Of course, they need to be shot down.
Thank you, Mr. Oleksandr. Thank you. Oleksandr Musiienko, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and head of the Center for Military Legal Studies, was in the studio of the National Marathon today. Thank you.